Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 165. Reconciliation. A process with many steps. At no point during this final did Toshinori know what Midoriya was going to do next. The first thing he heard from the boy was his voice echoing down the street as he cursed out his teammate. The anger was palpable. Through the distance, he was yelling with even more vitriol than he had been the last time they had spoken. This wasn't the boy he knew, a thought among many others that had kept him up for the past week. He didn't know if he was allowed to talk to the boy, and on top of that, he didn't know how to anymore. Their relationship had always been conversationally stunted, a fact that made sense in retrospect, but now more than ever. He had been racking his brain, trying to figure out what Aizawa and Yamada wanted from him in this test. He had yet to find an answer that made sense. He doubted they wanted him to give it his all and crush the boy under his heel. He certainly didn't have the stomach for that, even if that were the goal. Going easy on him didn't make sense either. What would that prove to anyone? Perhaps they just wanted him to spend the week stressing himself to death over it. If that was the goal, then they executed their plan flawlessly. He decided a balance was the best way to approach things. He wouldn't be a pushover, but he wouldn't be brutal either. Of course, no plan ever survives contact with the enemy. Midoriya leaping down from a rooftop was a scene straight from the past week's nightmares. Bakugo had been easy to brush aside. He was a tough young man, but Midoriya had already been through so much pain, and every fiber of his being needed to protect him from even so much as a paper cut befalling him. He tried to fight back against the barrage Midoriya was pelting him with, but every time he so much as thought about raising his hand against him, something deep in his chest ached. Well, his entire body ached. Midoriya was not going easy on him. It stroked his ego and stung his pride in equal measure to know that the boy packed this much of a punch. He couldn't just stand by and take the hits, or they were going to start wearing on him. He needed to take down Bakugo. Their plan was clear to him now. The boy was likely over halfway to the exit, and Toshinori would just be handing them victory on a silver platter if he didn't do something about that. Midoriya was fast, but not quite as fast as him. Not yet, at least. So he took a flying leap to the sky in search of the runaway. He wasn't prepared for the hand around his ankle, and he wasn't prepared to look down and be sent a year back in time to the day he first broke this poor kid's heart. He was so young. He still looked as young as the day they met. How could he have said that to such wide, hopeful eyes? He could tell that Midoriya was getting agitated with his lack of action, but he still shielded him from the fall against his chest, a strategic failure of which the boy took full advantage. He punched Toshinori directly in the center of the awful blooming scar on his side, hard enough to launch himself out of the tight embrace Toshinori had used to protect him. The blow knocked him on his ass and had him choking on blood. In that moment, he felt like he had already failed whatever test he was being given. Midoriya shouted at him about taking things seriously when Bakugo returned of his own volition. It seemed the two were still at odds. That wasn't a very strategic play. They had victory in the bag, and now they still might have it. Midoriya's power was enough to smart, and Bakugo's on top of that was enough to start really wearing him down. If this test weren't on such a tight time constriction, then their stamina may come out on top. Of course, that's what he had thought until Midoriya decided that he was going to heed his own advice and take this fight seriously. He stopped his strategic staggered blows, which left him enough time to dodge hits that weren't coming, and started attacking relentlessly. That ferocity was not something he could withstand for long, and the pain was starting to outshine the pride. He was doing his best to garner the will to strike back when Midoriya gave him the gutting words of encouragement that he needed. "What's this accomplishing other than proving that I'm not worth your time?" He was right. That was the precise reason he had decided not to go easy on him. He was going to hurt him more with his inaction than he would with his fists, even though it felt like trying to stick his hand into a pot of boiling water of his own volition. He bit the bullet and fought back. On Midoriya's next strike, he gave as good as he got, sending the boy tumbling backward into the wreckage young Bakugo had created earlier. He preoccupied himself with the barrage Bakugo sent his way and didn't look back to check if his boy was okay until he had already pulled himself from the debris. Toshinori's heart dropped when he saw him. His face was covered in blood, trailing all the way down his neck, and he was walking as if he were on a ship in the middle of a storm. The sight brought back images of him standing on a mangled leg covered in the blood of that foul creature, seconds away from death. Even Bakugo stopped fighting at the sight of him. Dear God, what had he done? His mind was unable to process anything other than searing guilt and panic until a handcuff was clasped around his wrist and an announcement of the student's victory was played over the loudspeakers. He looked back down at Midoriya to see his previously unfocused eyes looking back at him with clarity and an unreadable expression. He tricked him. He was just acting. Toshinori hoped that the laughter he let out was more congratulatory than hysterical. He did his best to play it off, but he was shaken. This was not the boy he knew. He was beginning to question if he ever really knew him at all. At the very least, there were large swaths of himself that he had never dared to share. How much more was lying just beneath the surface? What did he do to make the boy think that he didn't want to know and love every part of him? And perhaps, more importantly than anything else, how is he supposed to fix this? He had more than a few bumps and bruises, but nothing to trouble Recovery Girl over. Young Bakugo certainly needed tending to more than he did, so he ambled his way to the staff locker room to change. That was most of his time for the day anyways. He had no use for his suit now. He had expected the room to be empty, with him being the last of them to face off against the students. But there was a shower running. He didn't think much of it until the water shut off and President Mike stepped out, their skin looking pink and raw. I thought I heard you. I still feel like I got bugs crawling all over me, but I think we need to talk. They voluntarily spoke to him for the first time since last Saturday. They no doubt saw his hesitation, glancing around at the fairly public room and pointedly ignoring both of their states of undress. Not right this second, they corrected. Get dressed. We can go to meeting room B. He was sure his discomfort was palpable, but he did as he was told. He finished changing first and left for the meeting room to let Yamada have his privacy. Certainly not because he also felt like he had bugs crawling all over his skin at the thought of the conversation to come. He tried to convince himself that this was for the best, that talking was getting one step closer to things going back to normal. But the optimism wasn't doing much to help the gnawing anxiety. Hizashi had spent enough time skirting around the issue. He needed to talk to Yagi, preferably before Sho or Izuku got to him. He'd put it off because he'd reluctantly agreed with Netsu that Izuku needed to see All Might struggling with this too. He needed to see that All Might was flawed. He made the wrong choices and said the wrong things, just like any other person on the planet. They hadn't expected to have this conversation so soon, but when opportunity presents itself, they had learned it was best to take it. They all needed to talk again, the four of them, preferably under less duress. But he wanted to talk to him one-on-one because Sho tended to be a little too harsh and Izuku a little too forgiving. That train wreck in waiting would probably go more smoothly if he and Yagi could get on the same page first, or at least they hoped it would. Part of them wanted to take their time getting dressed just to leave Yagi squirming, but they pushed that inclination away and followed after him shortly. When they made it to the agreed-upon rendezvous, Yagi was sitting against the arm of the small couch with his legs crossed and his foot tapping nervously against nothing. How'd the final go? They asked casually. They were under no disillusions that Yagi would actually calm down before they got into the meat of the issue, but it was worth a try at least. "Oh, yes, you've been in the shower for a while, haven't you?" Yagi tried to return the light-hearted tone, but it fell flat under the weight of his clear apprehension. "Yes, and I'd be in there for another 4 hours if I could, though I doubt it would make a difference. Ugh, God, I hate bugs." They didn't need to fake the shudder that racked their body at the thought of why they had been in that shower in the first place. They took a seat across from Yagi and waited for him to respond to their question properly. Mine wasn't so harrowing, thankfully. I'm proud to say I lost," he replied after a tense moment. "What happened?" they asked more directly. "Oh, young Midoriya showed off another new talent. Apparently he's quite the actor. I tossed him out of the fight, and he came back with blood dripping down his face, walking like a drunk sailor. He got me good. Young Bakugo slapped the handcuffs on me before I could even blink," he explained, doing his best to maintain his normal cheery disposition and failing miserably. They smiled at that, even though it was clear they had gotten an abridged version. They were looking forward to watching the playback. That kid was brilliant, and they so rarely got the chance to see him in action. "Did you two talk at all?" they probed. Yagi cringed. This wasn't going to be good, was it? "He spoke to me, but I'm afraid I didn't. Well, I couldn't quite find the words. He was rather upset. I was going too easy on him. I just couldn't. I can't bear hurting him any more than I already have. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, I suppose," Yagi answered with a bitter laugh and surprising honesty. They hummed in acknowledgement, but they didn't really know what to say to that either. He was glad that Nedzu's plan worked to some degree, but even if it was for a good cause, they felt bad about allowing the blatant manipulation. The man looked miserable, slumped on the couch and looking at the floor. His shoulders were slack, and it was hard to believe they were the same shoulders that held up the world as they knew it. They couldn't help the sting of pity they felt. However, they were still angry at him, extremely so, and they doubted they would stop being angry anytime soon. The less favorable side of them reveled in Yagi's clear distress, but that wasn't who they wanted to be. Unfortunately, the distress was necessary and was only going to get worse. However, distress without direction didn't help anyone. They needed to make sure they steered this down the right path. "Yagi, are you happy? You're near retirement at this point. Are you happy with how you've lived your life?" they asked. Yagi looked up at him in confusion at the sharp pivot the conversation had taken. Hizashi held his gaze, and Yagi shrunk under their scrutiny as he thought about their question. Yes. It's been an honor to do what I've done," he stated after a while. "That's not what I asked, and I think you know that. I'm not asking if you lived a good life or if you did good work. I'm not asking you about your achievements. I'm asking you if you are happy. No one can deny you've changed the world for the better, and I'm sure sitting at the top and keeping people safe has been an honor. But were you happy there? With your secrets, sitting on that pillar, holding the world up all by yourself for decades. Did it make you happy? Not was it the right thing, not would you do it again. Did it make you happy?" He stressed each word the last time he asked. This was cruel, and he knew it was, but it was much kinder than what his less favorable side wanted to do. He hadn't forgotten Izuku's sudden interest in limelight heroics on top of everything else that was going on. They had a feeling they had found the culprit of that shift. Yagi looked at him like the thought had never crossed his mind, like he didn't even know what being happy for his own sake meant, and Hizashi was sure that he didn't. As much as he wanted to hate All Might for what he did to Izuku, he knew he only did it because he didn't know any better. Hizashi had no doubt that Yagi genuinely had the world's best interests at heart, but that doesn't mean that he did the right thing. He may love Izuku, but that does not mean he did right by him. Yagi stuttered through a mess of consonants, trying to answer them for a while. He was trying to justify it all, trying to convince himself that he was happy, to hold on to the denial he'd been clinging to for decades, but it was flimsy and it was crumbling. Hizashi watched as it finally broke. Yagi had looked absolutely miserable the past few days, walking around like a kicked puppy. It was subtle to most, and he never let it show in front of the students, but Hizashi was too good at reading people for it to slip under his radar. It wasn't so subtle now. He looked nearly as wrecked as he had last Saturday in their apartment as he finally choked out a no. They let the admission weigh heavily in the air for an uncomfortably long moment before they spoke again. Then why the hell would you try to force that life onto Izuku? They were rubbing salt in the wound at this point, but Yagi needed to understand what he'd done. You are beyond reckless, Yagi. You throw yourself into trouble with no regard for how your suffering hurts others. You're so selfless that it's selfish. And Izuku is the same way. You are setting him up to be a martyr. I understand that you mean well. I have no doubts about that. I know you adore Izuku, but you are a terrible influence on him, he asserted. Yagi was biting down on his trembling lip as tears started to well in his sunken eyes, but he didn't argue. I know you feel awful. I know you didn't mean to hurt anyone, but you did. You need to set a better example if you want to be a part of his life. You need to take care of yourself. You need to get help. He was silently sobbing at this point. He cried just like Shota and Izuku, like his suffering needed to be quiet, like he wasn't allowed to bother anyone with it. Hizashi hated it. He had no clue what the world had done to Yagi to make him this way, but he couldn't help but pity him like this. He had given every single bit of himself for the safety of the people until he hardly even had his flesh and bones left. He was a good man. He didn't deserve this, but the world was a cruel place. He reminded them so much of Izuku. Half of him wanted to leave him here to cry alone, but the better half of him walked over and gently laid a hand on his shaking shoulder. Yagi, you need help. I don't know what all you've been through, but I know a fake smile when I see one. You deserve help. You deserve better. Izuku deserves better. If not for yourself, then for him. Get better for him, he said in a much gentler tone than he'd been using up until this point. Yagi was leaning forward with his face in his hands as he cried, and it made him look so small. For such a big man, he didn't take up much room. And God, if that wasn't a metaphor in and of itself. Hizashi handed him the box of tissues from the side table and leaned on the arm of his chair as they rubbed soothing circles on his back. People didn't get better alone. As much as Hizashi wanted to turn his back on him, he owed it to Izuku to stay. He owed it to Yagi to stay. It was confusing how much Yagi deserved their anger and didn't deserve it at the same time, so they decided not to dwell on it. He was crying, and Hizashi could help. It didn't need to be any more complicated than that. End of chapter.